Port Charles had seen its fair share of villains, bad choices, and moral gray zones, but few storms started as quietly as the one that followed Hank, Dalton into town. On paper, Dalton was a prize, a brilliant researcher with a spotless reputation, a man whose work promised to revolutionize neurological treatment and bring national attention to General Hospital. The hospital board saw prestige, donors saw dollar signs, and even skeptical staff members tried to believe that this time, Port Charles might actually get a win without a hidden cost. But beneath the polished press releases and carefully curated charm, Dalton arrived carrying something far more dangerous than experimental data. He brought ego, fear, and a willingness to destroy anyone who stood between him and his ambitions. That included a teenager who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at exactly the wrong time, Rocco Falconeri. The turning point came on a night that should have been routine. Security alarms echoed through the quiet corridors of the hospital's research wing, drawing staff and guards toward Dalton's lab. Inside, chaos reigned. Equipment had been damaged, vials shattered, and a faint chemical smell hung in the air. At the center of it all, Dalton emerged with his lab coat singed and his voice rising in theatrical outrage. Before anyone could fully assess the situation, he had already decided on a culprit. He claimed he had seen a shadow bolt out of the room just before the alarms went off, and that shadow, he insisted, belonged to Rocco. The accusation landed like a grenade. Rocco was quickly pulled from the periphery of hospital life into the harsh spotlight, a teenager suddenly treated like a hardened criminal. Dalton's version of events spread faster than any official report, carrying with it the weight of his status and the veneer of scientific authority. For Rocco, it happened so fast it barely felt real. One moment, he was a kid who occasionally cut through the hospital halls on his way to visit friends and family, and the next, he was being questioned about sabotage, vandalism, and intent. He hadn't sabotaged anything. He hadn't even been near the lab when the alarms went off. But facts mattered less than optics, and Dalton framed the story perfectly. He painted himself as the victim of a reckless teenager who'd lashed out after a perceived slight, weaving in fragments of overheard conversations and twisted half-truths about Rocco's temper to create a narrative that felt plausible to anyone who didn't know the boy. Soon, whispers followed Rocco wherever he went, in the hospital corridors, at the cafe, at school. People looked at him differently, with suspicion, with doubt, with that particular brand of pity reserved for kids who are already on a bad path. The fallout rippled through his family just as violently. Dante, who had spent his life walking the tightrope between law enforcement and a father who ruled the criminal underworld, suddenly found himself watching his son become a target of a system he'd sworn to uphold. Olivia's heart broke in ways she couldn't even articulate. She had fought for years to protect her son from danger, only to now face a threat cloaked in law and infrastructure rather than guns and alleyways. They knew Rocco, knew his heart, knew the look on his face when he was being honest, and they believed him. But belief didn't erase evidence, and Dalton made sure there was plenty of that. Security footage mysteriously corrupted, at critical points, access logs that seemed to place Rocco near the lab, and a convenient string of circumstantial details lined up to make the accusation stick. It didn't take long for word of the situation to reach sunny Corinthos. At first, he heard only fragments: a lab accident, a brilliant scientist, a teenage suspect. But the moment he learned that the teenager in question was his grandson, the temperature in Sunny's world dropped several degrees. He had seen this pattern too many times before: powerful men twisting the truth, hiding behind titles and credentials, using kids as scapegoats to shield themselves. He had spent a lifetime doing things he wasn't proud of, but there were lines Sunny would never tolerate others crossing, and one of those lines was dragging a child into the crosshairs to save one's own skin. Initially, Sunny tried to stay out of it in the way he often promised himself he would. He let Dante and Alexis handle the legal front, trusting that the justice system could do its job if given enough pressure and attention. Alexis began looking into Dalton's background, combing through old grants, published papers, and employment records. She found inconsistencies that bothered her: data anomalies dismissed as typos, staff complaints that disappeared from HR files, quiet settlements from former research assistants who had abruptly left his previous institutions. Rick, never one to pass up an opportunity to dismantle a corrupt figure propped up by false respectability, joined in, offering his own brand of strategic insight. Together, they started to pull at the carefully knotted threads of Dalton's story. Meanwhile, Rocco's life shrank down to sterile rooms and tense conversations, punctuated by the heavy silence that followed every mention of the word trial. The idea that he might actually face real legal consequences for something he didn't do pressed down on him with suffocating weight. Every time he tried to tell his side of the story, it felt like he was talking to a wall made of polite nods and skeptical eyes. He wasn't a scientist, he wasn't a respected adult, he didn't have a string of accolades to validate his word. He was just a kid. Dalton, on the other hand, had a podium and a microphone, and he used both with calculated skill. Then came the discovery that changed everything. A technician, working late and exhausted, made a mistake. They failed to fully delete a set of backup files from a subdirectory on the hospital's server. Those files, recovered during Alexis's meticulous digital trawl, contained system logs that didn't match Dalton's sworn testimony. The security system had recorded an access card swipe into the lab minutes before the alarms triggered, but it wasn't Rocco's access card. It was Dalton's. Additionally, internal camera data that had been declared irretrievable by the IT team showed brief, glitchy but still recognizable frames of Dalton alone in the lab, handling equipment in a way that didn't scream victim of a sudden attack, but rather man rearranging a crime scene. The more they uncovered, the more grotesque the truth appeared. Dalton had sabotaged his own lab, then built a frame job around a vulnerable teenager to cast himself as both victim and hero. When Sunny was presented with this evidence, something in him snapped, not with the hot, impulsive rage of a street brawl, but with the slow, controlled burn of a man who has spent a lifetime making people pay for crossing the people he loves. He had given the system its chance. He had watched lawyers gather evidence and file motions. He had watched his grandson sit in rooms where his future was debated like a theoretical exercise. And now he knew the truth. Dalton had weaponized his intellect and status to target a child, simply because it was convenient. For Sonny, that moved Dalton from problem to threat. And threats, in Sonny's world, didn't get second chances. From that point on, every choice Sonny made was guided by a single, unwavering decision. Dalton would never be allowed to hurt his family, or anyone else, ever again. The word, eliminate, took on layers of meaning in his mind. Yes, there was the old instinct, the one that whispered about back rooms, quiet docks, and the kind of final resolutions that never showed up on arrest records. But Sonny had evolved, whether he liked to admit it or not. He had children and grandchildren watching him, a life built on uneasy truces, and a fragile peace held together by the understanding that he was no longer the man who solved every problem with a gun. Now, eliminating Dalton had to mean destroying the foundation of power he stood on, ripping away his credibility, exposing his lies, and making sure he faced consequences so complete that he could never climb back into a position where he could destroy another life. So Sonny did what he does best when he's not pulling a trigger. He started to move in the shadows of influence. He leaned on donors who had funded Dalton's work, forcing them to reconsider their support. He reached out to journalists who still remembered what it meant to pursue the truth with teeth, feeding them just enough information to start asking dangerous questions. He had people dig into Dalton's past, and when they unearthed whispered rumors of other accidents, and other promising young scapegoats left behind at previous institutions, he made sure those whispers turned into documented patterns. Dalton's spotless reputation began to fracture, then crumble, under the weight of scrutiny. In parallel, Alexis and Rick brought the legal hammer down. With the recovered logs and video footage, they built a case that didn't just prove Rocco's innocence but meticulously documented Dalton's deliberate fraud. They filed motions, petitioned for the charges against Rocco to be dropped, and demanded an inquiry into Dalton's conduct and the hospital's failure to properly vet him. The courtroom hearings that followed were not just about one teenager and one scientist. They became a referendum on how easily power can be abused when everyone assumes the man in the white coat must be on the right side of history. Dalton, cornered, still tried to claw his way out. He claimed the logs were manipulated, the footage taken out of context, the accusations part of a vendetta orchestrated by a mobster family trying to crush a noble scientist. He stood in front of cameras, eyes glistening with carefully rehearsed outrage, insisting he had only ever wanted to save lives and push medicine forward. But this time, the city wasn't so quick to believe him. Too much smoke had gathered around his carefully curated image. Too many questions lingered about the timing of his accusations, the gaps in his past, the faces of other young people who had once stood where Rocco now stood. In the end, it wasn't a gunshot in a dark alley that eliminated Dalton from Port Charles. It was the slow, relentless dismantling of his power. His grants were suspended. His lab was shut down pending full investigation. His name, once spoken with admiration, now traveled through the town laced with suspicion and resentment. Legally, he faced charges of perjury, fraud, and falsification of evidence, alongside professional censure that would follow him anywhere he tried to rebuild his career. The man who had tried to sacrifice a teenager's future to protect his prestige found himself stripped of the very status he'd been willing to destroy a child to preserve. For Rocco, the road back was not as simple as a judge's ruling or a cleared record. The damage lingered, in the way people hesitated before saying his name, in the flinch he had to fight whenever someone in authority raised their voice, in the restless nights where he replayed the frantic early days of the accusation over and over in his mind. But he also saw something he hadn't expected, his family standing unshaken at his side, refusing to let him believe he was anything less than the boy they knew before Dalton ever set foot in their lives. Dante, who had walked the divide between law and blood his entire life, finally saw those two worlds align as the truth prevailed without Sonny needing to revert to the worst parts of his past. As for Sonny, he understood that there were people in town who would always suspect he'd done more than just pull strings and push information into the right hands. They would look at Dalton's downfall and wonder if some unseen hand had tipped the scales harder than anyone could prove. Sonny didn't bother to correct them. In his mind, what mattered was simple. The danger had been neutralized, and a man who preyed on the vulnerable had been rendered powerless. Dalton would not get the chance to ruin another child's life. The system had done its job this time, but only because Sonny decided it was going to, one way or another. In a city where justice is often delayed, distorted, or bought outright, the saga of Dalton and Rocco carved out a rare kind of victory. It was a reminder that monsters don't always show up with guns or knives. Sometimes they arrive with degrees, lab coats, and smiles. And it was a warning, to anyone who might think of using the innocent as shields, that Port Charles still has guardians willing to burn down an illusion to protect the truth, even if they have to walk dangerously close to their darkest instincts to do it.